Our next guest recently became the 11th president of Spelman College. It's a really famous college, the nation's oldest historically black liberal arts college for women. Spelman is the country's leading producer of black women completing PhDs in STEM fields. I spoke to Dr. Helen Gayle, president of Spelman, just a little while ago. Take a listen.
Dr. Gayle, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, I first should say congratulations, because I know you've moved from Chicago to Atlanta, and you're the new president of such a distinguished and important college in the country, Spelman College. And I guess, the big thing I want to do today is, one, I want our viewers to know how important HBCUs like Spelman are. But there's another dimension here. I mean, our historic black colleges and universities have been around for a long time, and that hasn't fixed the problem of achieving genuine diversity, inclusion, and really a kind of fair and equitable, civil society when it comes to different dimensions. And I guess, as we sort of look at what's needed, not only in your role at Spelman, but more broadly in a societal sense, what do we need to do?
Well, thank you. First of all, pleasure to be part of this discussion, this very important discussion, because I think it is one of the key solutions, if you will, to a lot of the problems and challenges we face. We need to make sure that we have everyone involved in making our world more just and equitable, and not have obstacles to doing that. And so, as you mentioned, I am president of a historically black college and university. We have a lot to contribute to this, but there is no one answer to how you fix these issues. And I think part of it is that education is not an island unto itself. Education is part of our overall society, and I think it is one piece of the puzzle of how do we make sure that we provide opportunities for all young people to achieve their educational goals so that they can contribute to society. So I think first and foremost, it takes intentionality. It takes intentionality not only to make sure that institutions like mine that do provide a real important opportunity for children, young people of African descent, but that we make sure that all of our institutions are thinking intentionally about how do you have as diverse a mix as possible. Because again, that's the cornerstone of our democracy, to have every voice be able to be at the table and be able to contribute to making our nation and ultimately our world the kind of place we want our children and our grandchildren to inherit. So I think it's being intentional. It's making sure that we're looking at what the obstacles and barriers are. Oftentimes they're financial, but they're not always financial. There's a range of different obstacles. And then making sure that we're thinking about it, again, intentionally, what do we want to see for the future of education, and the kind of education that continues to prepare young minds to lead us into the future.
So let me ask you a question. It's sort of a two-parter. One, what more do you need to succeed, particularly your students to succeed? And secondly, Spelman has such an extraordinary history of producing, particularly women in science and others that have contributed. How do we scale what Spelman has done so that it gets absorbed into the practice and patterns of other universities, so that other women and women of color are engaged in science and math and the sort of STEM world, if you will, in which there's just a very clear deficit?
Yeah, so first and foremost, HBCUs for a long time have punched well above our weight. When we look at, for instance, one of the biggest determinants of whether a school is affordable and whether there's access from a financial standpoint is endowment. So if you look at all of the HBCUs together, our endowments don't equal oftentimes the single endowment of some of our predominantly white institutions. And, so some of this is really, how do you make sure that institutions like Spelman are able to make college affordable, oftentimes for young people who might not have the financial resources. One of the things that I think Spelman does well, like so many HBCUs, is to just believe that our students are capable. And I hear all the time young people who are here that say, being in a place that values who they are, that doesn't question their capability, and that believes that they can achieve is just a hugely important environment to be in. And I think sometimes we don't recognize how undervalued students feel, particularly students, first gen students, students of color, et cetera, who go to majority institutions where there may not be a history of understanding the cultures and the backgrounds that young people come from, and that therefore value who they are as students. So we have to be able to meet students where they are, recognize that, all of us have brilliance, all of us have potential. And how are we making sure that everyone who walks through the door of any institution knows that people believe in them and are conspiring for their success?
I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I went onto your website today and I saw, going to Spelman is not cheap. It's not inexpensive. Making an investment in education wherever you go in the country can be a very expensive affair. We just had President Biden initiate a process for people of certain income to have past student debt given some relief, $10,000 in some cases and up to $20,000 if they'd receive Pell Grants. But I guess, how do we get back at looking at education, tying it to pathways to, enough financial success that investment is worth it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's important to realize that education is critical. It's foundational. But ultimately, even at a liberal arts college like ours, we want to make sure that we're preparing students for careers in the future, so that education is worth it. We're about $40,000 in tuition and fees. That's not inexpensive. But, we feel that it's worth it. As you mentioned, we're the top producer of Black women who go on to get PhDs in STEM. U.S. News and World Report just came out with their ratings. We can all quibble about what that means, but, we continue to be top rated for innovation in our teaching, service learning, global experiences, on and on. So, we know we produce and provide a lot for the dollars that we get, but we've got to continue to make college, not only at Spelman, but across our nation, seen as a public good, and make sure that it is affordable to all. And that, again, we meet students where they are so that we can make sure that there aren't obstacles to getting a good education and then using that education to be able to have fulfilling careers.
Dr. Gayle, I'm not sure I'm going to get this question out right, but I'm sort of interested. A friend of mine, Kevin Young, a poet, is the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I think he sort of sees his role in two ways. One, he thinks it's very important that African American citizens see their place in American history, their place on the Mall in Washington, their place. And then another part of it is to help interpret, for people like myself who didn't know the 1921 Tulsa race massacre happened, to broaden our aperture to understand that our history is tied into the history of that building and everything. And I think it's a wonderful mission. I think it's a hard mission because so many people end up in bubbles. And I'm interested in the degree to which you think, do you have a responsibility and a pathway to helping broader society understand the importance of what you're doing at Spelman? And do you find that open to you, or do you find it tough?
Well, I find it tough for all the reasons that you just articulated. We do live in bubbles, we live in silos, and we don't always know each other's histories and culture. But, I think it's one of the contributions a school like Spelman can make in uplifting our history, our culture, and have our students be ambassadors, if you will, for helping to broaden that aperture, broaden that cultural understanding, because that's the way, we as this ever increasingly diverse society are going to be able to incorporate everyone into our society. It's by understanding each other, understanding our backgrounds, our histories, and also understanding, the similarities that we all have even coming from different cultural backgrounds. So we see our students as the best ambassadors. Our faculty, who are world class and, are out there talking about their field of expertise. We find them as, some of our best ambassadors for broadening that aperture and increasing cultural awareness.
You came from the Chicago Community Trust, and Chicago is a place in constant sort of churn and evolution and tumult and social issues. And I often tell people, I sort of feel like history and identity are negotiated. I mean, they evolve and change over time. And I'm really interested, as you look at the politics in our country, the way people do it, I'm sure at Spelman, you're going to have, those that get politically active on both sides of the aisle, or maybe they're more than two. But in this, how do you deal with the evolving identity challenges that are going on in this nation and yet still set a North Star on civic engagement for your students? I know that's a little wonky, but I just want to know how you do it in a fair way so that people have freedom to sort of explore their political expression and identity, but yet they understand that there's a lot of diversity of thought in this country. I don't think we talk about this enough.
Well, I think that's, part of the value of college campuses. College campuses are ideas factories, if you will. It's a place where people can come together and talk about a divergence of issues, divergence of opinions. And I think this is where you start helping young people understand how to agree to disagree, but to do that in a civil way. How do you have the kind of discussions? And sometimes that starts with very simple things like, who keeps which food in the refrigerator, to the big issues of world politics. And so I think colleges and universities have a real responsibility and a real opportunity to have that kind of setting that allows for open dialogue and help us to all understand, how do you have differences of opinion, but still at the end of the day, realize that we're all about the same thing. We want a better world. We want peace. We want security. And, I think colleges and universities have a lot to offer in that regard.
Well, Dr. Helene Gayle is president of Spelman College. These are issues that are very important to us. We're very grateful that you brought Spelman and yourself and your ideas, because these are things you can't be complacent about, right? It's sort of an ongoing inquiry in how to get it right. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.